Suddenly you see a toddler in the screen, which we want to avoid, obviously, for the recording and so we can upload on YouTube. Hello to people from Bristol, Gillingham, Wales. Oh my, I see someone from Greece. Hello. Yes, that is way too close to my heart. Hello. I see people from Essex, Ireland. All right. Kalamazoo, so many people. Reading. All right, we have a proper crowd, proper crowd. Hampshire, US. Welcome, everybody. Welcome. All right, I'll get started. Um, My name is Thanos Bostanis. I am a lecturer at the Tizard Center at the University of Kent. For those of you who do not know Tizard, we do research, offer consultancy and master's courses focused on supporting individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities. As part of our work, we offer a master's in applied behavior analysis and positive behavior support. To disseminate good practice in behavior analysis, we also organize these behavioral talks, as we call them, where we invite our esteemed colleagues to share their good practice in behavior analysis. We also have a peer-reviewed journal. It's called the Tizard Learning Disability Review. For those of you who are not from the UK, what we mean by learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, as we use that term a bit more internationally. So not people who are diagnosed with dyslexia, dyscalculia, and so on, but people who have an intellectual disability, if we want to use the more international term. So that is a peer-reviewed journal, and we always invite submissions from practitioners and researchers. If you are working in the field of intellectual disabilities, by all means, consider sharing your practice with us. We have some special issues currently going on verbal behavior, on reframing applied behavior analysis. We recently published a 2-volume special issue on positive behavior support in the UK. And generally, we're trying to be quite active in disseminating really good practice in the area of intellectual disabilities. Today, I'm going to interrupt Jenn at 3 points to deliver keywords for your CEUs. Please make a note of those. I will post a link to a Microsoft form that's sitting in your browser. And then when the talk finishes, please add your keywords, your name, certification numbers, and so on. And we will sort out your complimentary CEU. Now, without further ado, thank you, Dr. Wertalik, for joining us today. Just so you guys have a bit of context, Jenn shared with me that there is a book coming up on sex education for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I said, that is amazing. That's so desperately needed in our field. So come and do a talk about sexual education and give us an opportunity to learn more about this area. And obviously the book that you guys worked on recently. So Jenn, please take it away, introduce yourself. I'll be in the background supporting, and I will only interrupt for the keywords. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Thanos. And first, I just want to thank you and the Tizard Center for having me here today. I'm super excited for our talk. Just really quickly about me, I am an associate professor at Georgia Southern University, where I primarily teach graduate coursework in behavior analysis, but I also teach some undergraduate courses in behavior analysis as well. I'm also our experiential learning coordinator, so I coordinate practicum experiences for undergraduate students who are just getting an interest into the field, as well as our graduate students who are accruing their fieldwork supervision hours for certification. I have a varied line of research. I am a precision teacher. I've done work with functional life skills, video-based interventions, tag teach methodology, and of course, sexuality education. So prior to coming to academia, I was in practice for 12 years in a public school system, and I primarily worked with adolescents and young adults who had an autistic diagnosis, as well as developmental disabilities and intellectual disabilities as well. So a lot of that has created a drive, and where I've come from has really supported where my research goes and what I am passionate about. So before I get fully started, I do need to take a moment to give a really big thank you to my two colleagues, Pam Wolf and Cheryl Ostrin. Pam, I got randomly assigned to her at Penn State to be her graduate assistant, but without her, I would not even be here talking to you all today on this topic. She kind of was forced to have me along for the ride, but then she made the choice to ask me to come along the ride after I graduated. And I've been so fortunate to be able to do some research with Pam. And obviously now we have, the three of us have written a book that has recently become available. So big shout out to Pam. And then of course, Cheryl as well, one of my colleagues who's also worked hand in hand with us on this book. The content today stems from part of our book, but just general also knowledge about sexual education. But without the two of them, I would not be sitting here right now and we wouldn't be talking about this topic. So just wanted to make sure I preface that as we go along. For today, obviously this is going to have some mature content. So just to let everybody know that, given our topic. But also throughout the presentation, you will hear me use both disability first and person first language throughout, just to be respectful of all preferences. But my goals are to talk a little bit more about sexual education and the state of sexuality education more globally, and then really move into more of what it looks like for our neurodiverse populations, particularly autistic individuals and individuals with an IDD diagnosis. We're going to talk about some myths and misconceptions in this area, and it's particularly related to those individuals. Move into how we can take a proactive approach, and then how we can infuse behavior analysis into our methodologies and teaching in this area. So to start, whenever I think about sexuality education, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how uncomfortable and difficult it can be for people to, first of all, talk about sex, as well as then move into sexuality education. So sometimes I start to think about, like, do any of us remember those times where our parents had to have that sex talk with us? How did you feel? How uncomfortable was it? And then flipping it, thinking about maybe how uncomfortable it was for them to even have to do it. And maybe many people here are parents themselves and have been through this too. So just discussions about it. I mean, obviously I have been in this area for a pretty long time now, so I am extremely comfortable talking about all of this, but that's not the case for everybody. So just generally speaking, it has been uncomfortable and an area hard for people to tackle. Okay. And then within the US, and I apologize to all my UK folks and beyond, a lot of my information is coming directly from the US, but I kind of have a suspicion that you may also see things in this area where you are too. But particularly in the US, there's a lot of longstanding debates about sexuality instruction. Should it be provided? Okay, not all states require sexuality education. And a lot of this information I've included because I know before I dove into this, I didn't realize a lot of this existed and that there was a lot of issues here. So a lot of states don't even require it to take place. And then if it is provided, what topics should it include? So content varies across states and even within individual school districts and different school levels. So what's being taught, there's no consistency within that framework. Also, what program or curriculum should you use? Okay, what are schools using? The efficacy and availability of traditional sexuality education programs and curricula also vary greatly as well. And again, this is really posed towards just neurotypical students in the gen ed populations to start with. So even within those areas, there's variability in terms of what curriculums to use, are they actually even effective, and can we get access to them? So I've included some stats here just because some of this to me is like mind-boggling. It's just bizarre to hear some of these things. And they really kind of struck a chord. So the Guttmeyer Institute is a leading research and policy organization, and they're committed to advancing sexuality and sexual and reproductive health and rights across the world. And so these numbers come from a lot of the information from their website. But I will say there is some variability in terms of the numbers. Things do change here and there and across the time. But these were some of the recent numbers too. So 38 states here in the US and the District of Columbia mandate sex education or HIV education. 30 of those states and DC mandate, when it is provided, sex and HIV education programs meet certain general requirements. So only 30 plus 1, 31 entities actually require certain general requirements. Others are left up to the individual districts and entities providing the instruction. 26 states and DC require instruction to be appropriate. 17 states require program content to be medically accurate. That one always strikes a chord for me, because that means we have all these other entities that are able to put out information that may not be accurate, which is just kind of seems so contradictory to me that that even can happen and is allowed to happen. 26 states and DC require that it be appropriate for the student's age. So we don't even have any consistency there that what should be taught when to our students and what's appropriate for them to have at different ages as they go through their educational process. 10 states require that the program to provide instruction that's appropriate for cultural backgrounds and that's not biased against any race, sex, or ethnicity. I hope these are kind of sitting there for you and striking some chords as well. Just 10. So out of where we have requirements, only 10 are required to provide this type and look at cultural backgrounds and not have this bias that exists. There's a big debate over right now, especially in the climate that we're in here in the US, about teaching gender identity, which becomes a really big topic as well. 4 states prohibit that programming, the program for promoting religion. So only 4 prohibit people from infusing religious beliefs into the educational program. So you may see some of that sneaking in too when teachers or school districts are promoting different curriculums as well. 39 states and DC require that information be provided on abstinence. And then within that, there's still some variability. Some say you just have to stress it. Others say that it needs to be covered in more detail. So again, just kind of highlighting some of the varied differences across states and what's currently happening in terms of when we do have this type of education, how much it still is going to vary depending on where you live. This is for, again, I mentioned like more of a gen ed type of sexuality education program. So when we start to move towards talking about neurodiverse populations, it becomes even more controversial and people get even more resistant to have these tough conversations. I put this quote in there because it really does kind of resonate to me and kind of to where we are still now. So Waxman in 1994 stated that no group in this country faces the sort of sexual and reproductive restrictions as disabled people do. We are frequently prevented from learning about sexuality, having sexual relationships, and having access to sexual literature. Okay, so again, coming from 1994, when obviously you could see some terminology in here stemming from that time period, although we've come away since then, we haven't come far enough because this is still an ongoing issue. Okay, there is still many individuals that are not being provided with or an opportunity to even have sexuality education within their educational framework or throughout their lifetime experiences. So research has found that also some parents and caregivers and healthcare providers and educators even feel really hesitant to discuss sexuality with this particular population. So when we're thinking about the autistic population, IDD populations, some of this stems from the fear of, if I talk about it, people are going to become more interested in it. Okay? A fear of increasing the likelihood of engaging in sexual related behaviors. Okay? So obviously you become more interested. Now I'm telling you more and more about them. It means now you're going to pursue them. Okay? Also a lack of confidence in one's own ability to teach the content, having a lack of resources, a lack of expertise in the area are really highly prevalent as well. So these areas and a few other things tend to perpetuate the current state of sexuality education for autistic individuals and individuals with IDD. And something else that still continues to come up are these myths and misconceptions. So oftentimes individuals, autistic individuals or individuals with IDD are often viewed as childlike and dependent on others. So regardless of their age, they're still being viewed as under 10 years old, for example. So I may be 25, but I'm being viewed and treated as a 6-year-old. So why would I teach a 6-year-old about having sex? Starts to come up, right? So because of that view, people tend to be very hands-off with this topic and this educational practice for that population. There's also a myth and misconception that individuals in this population do not engage in sexual behaviors at all, that it doesn't happen, okay? Or they don't have a desire for these sexual relationships. So why should we provide them with education? They don't do it and they don't want it. So why should we be even talking about this? Now, also, sometimes individuals are viewed as hypersexual, meaning that they have this intense focus on sex, sexuality, acts, and sexual fantasies. Okay, and if we talk more about this, we are just going to make them even more intensely focused on this. Also, the myth that individuals within this population are solely heterosexual, okay, that they're only attracted to the opposite sex or gender, which of course, these are myths and misconceptions, and we have known that they are not accurate statements at all, but they still persist. Okay? I've had conversations about these 13 years ago, and there's still conversations that come up today when speaking on this area. So these are still very much prevalent in our experiences. However, there is a great need for sexuality instruction and sexuality education. Okay? And first and foremost, the hands down biggest thing are that individuals, all individuals, including autistic individuals, individuals with IDD, are sexual beings just like all humans. And as humans, we are all should be afforded sexual rights to all of us. So for example, we should have the right to exercise sexuality free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. We should be able to have the right to attain the highest possible standard of sexual health, including access to sexual and reproductive health services. We should have the right to have one's bodily integrity respected and the right to choose. The right to choose whether or not we want to be sexually active, to choose who we would like our sexual partners to be, to choose to enter into consensual sexual relationships, and to decide whether or not and when we may want to have children. Okay? These are just a sample of our sexual rights. Okay? But first and foremost, these should be afforded to everybody. Okay? And we too often don't afford these rights to individuals of certain populations based on our biases and our different kinds of myths and misconceptions that are out there. So why we need to do it, first and foremost, it should be everybody's right to have it. Also, the desire for personal relationships. Research has shown that many autistic individuals do want to have a sexual relationship, and they actually do pursue them as often as their same age peers. Okay, so contrary to what a lot of people think in terms of wanting to have these relationships, the autistic population and community is telling us, yes, we do want them. Okay. Another reason why we need sexuality instruction is due to limited knowledge. Individuals with ASD have lower levels of sexual knowledge than their comparison groups of peers. Okay? And it's primarily due to a lack of access to education, first and foremost. So approximately 50% of adolescents with developmental disabilities have not received any type of professional sexuality education, which is highly problematic. Okay, so when we don't have enough knowledge and we don't have the correct means to find out information, it could lead us down a really bad path. Okay, so a lot of times what happens for neurotypical individuals, although they may not receive the best sexuality education program, if anything, they do report to learn a lot from their peers, their teachers, their parents, media. And sometimes autistic individuals are going to have limited access to peers, okay? And therefore they're more likely to learn from media, which can present with a lot of range of issues if anybody has been on social media lately. So due to this lack of knowledge and access to education, what tends to happen for this group of individuals is they're more likely than their neurotypical peers to engage in inappropriate courting behaviors or dating behaviors. So for example, they may have romantic feelings towards celebrities, strangers, or lesser known people in their lives. And sometimes what happens when we start to pursue those relationships for longer periods of time than their same age peers, we have a risk of them being deemed as stalkers, okay, and individuals being labeled as engaging in stalking-like behaviors. There's a risk of legal action and a risk of other just inappropriate sexual behavior starting to stem from not having access to this knowledge and being able to contact the right resources to be able to find out information.
Jen,
Yes.
I jump in just to deliver the first keyword, please. Folks, the first keyword is knowledge for your CEU. The first keyword is knowledge, as Jen was talking about limited knowledge. Okay, make a note of that for your CEU.
Okay, another reason why we need sexuality in instruction is protection from abuse. Okay, again, a huge one here. We have research that's noted that individuals are reporting higher levels of sexual victimization than their typical quote unquote control peers. We also have literature that tells us about sexual violence was 4 to 8 times more likely to occur with children with ID than children without disabilities or without those type of labels. And what happens here is that when we don't have the education, okay, individuals may not understand what's happening to them, that it's not okay. And therefore, they may not see it as that and even be less to report it. Okay, so a lot of these numbers are also deemed as often not quite accurate because the idea that a lot of this is taking place and not reported, or we just may not know that this is not okay to be happening to me. Protection from STIs and unplanned unwanted pregnancies is another really big area of concern and why we need sexuality instruction. Okay, we need it to help promote health and hygiene. And without education, individuals are at risk for the sexual related health issues, ranging from lack of just basic care to sexually transmitted diseases. Okay, so another kind of rationale of kind of why we should be looking in this area. And again, this is just a condensed list. There are a lot of other reasons as well, but these are some of the highlighted ones I think that really can start to, the more we talk about these, get people on board that this is really important. And even if you look at some of the dates on some of the literature, we've been talking about this for a while. Okay, this is not new information. So the idea is that, as Thanos said earlier, there's not a lot of resources. Research is starting to build a little bit, but there's still not a lot out there. It's just concerning for us as a field as well. So although the need for sexuality education has been very well documented, it has been in the past, typically what happens is we don't talk about it until we have an issue. So what I saw in practice, what I'm guilty of doing as well, as I did not have a lot of information at the time, was that when we start to see something deemed as inappropriate sexual behavior, like public masturbation, disrobing, touching others in different kinds of, in their private areas in a sexual manner, making sexual comments, when these things start to happen, that's when we realize, oh, we got a problem. We have to do something about it. And at that point, when these problems arise, we are being really reactive to it. And sure, we might then say, okay, we need to do some work here. We got to reduce problem behavior or unwanted behaviors, but we also may need to do instruction. It's not until something bad happens that we start to talk about this very often within our field. There are some researchers out there in 1999, the year I graduated high school, that were talking about how this was such an issue. And here we are in 2026, still seeing the exact same thing. It's not until something happens that we then become concerned about the issue or start to broach the topic of sexuality education. Okay, so when this happens, as behavior analysts or within the behavior analytic science, we do have tools that do help us assess and design interventions to help decrease problematic behaviors, and in particular, sexually inappropriate behaviors, as they're often titled. And I use the air quotes because a lot of times they're not necessarily, we have appropriate behavior just happening at the wrong time, in the wrong context, and it lacks stimulus control. But we do have, we have our functional analysis to determine the function of that behavior, and then we're able to start working on decreasing that behavior. So we have a vast literature base that tells us how to do that, and there also are some literature that tells us about the research in this area to decrease inappropriate sexual behavior. And what they found from there is, contrary to what we often think, not all sexual behaviors are maintained by automatic reinforcement. Okay, which is really interesting when you think about it, because a lot of times we just assume, given the nature of the behavior, that it is related, it's maintained by automatic reinforcement. So there is a lot, there has been research done that actually is contrary to that. So for example, we see sometimes some of these behaviors are maintained by attention as well. So it is really important that we conduct that functional analysis so we do know the function. Okay. And then we're able to teach a functionally equivalent replacement behavior. So we can use differential reinforcement of alternative behavior, functional communication training, right? We have a lot of interventions to help here. But when we're going to do this, sometimes, for example, if it is the behavior is maintained primarily by attention, we may teach that learner how to gain attention in more appropriate ways. We also may possibly teach maybe if we are masturbating in public, we may also teach, when and where to do this, but we would have never done that prior to. So here, I think the biggest thing is when we start looking at the behaviors occurring, yes, we need to decrease them, but we also need to broaden the scope. If the behavior is also related to sexual behavior, there is an indicator there that we need more instruction in that area as a whole, not just on that particular issue. But when this happens, typically nobody was ever going to talk about this and bring up the topic of sexuality education until we walked out in public and my client started masturbating in the middle of the mall. Okay, so again, very reactive in nature. So what my colleagues, myself, and a lot of other colleagues in the field, as well as kind of the advocates for sexuality education as a whole, what they are promoting is a more proactive approach. And the way in which we can do that, one way, is through the lens of providing comprehensive sexuality education. Okay, and this deals with providing age-appropriate, medically accurate information and guidance about not just what, our physical anatomy is and how everything works and all of that, but also the mental, emotional, and social dimensions that all fall under the umbrella of human sexuality. So it's viewed much more as a holistic approach where we are looking at emotional and social development as well. When we take the comprehensive approach, another key factor is just giving somebody information alone is never going to be enough. Okay, there needs to be opportunities to acquire different essential life skills and then time and work at developing positive attitudes and values. Okay, so we may look at the importance of developing different communication skills, decision-making skills, critical thinking skills. And when we add those in, many people sometimes are surprised because that's not what we typically think of sexuality education. We think birds and the bees. I know when I was in high school, my biggest memory of one of my sexuality education courses was I knew him as my gym teacher, but he stood in front of the class and did a fallopian tube dance and held out his arms and had a whole dance and through history of students going to that school, everybody remembers that, but that's all I remember. So the idea of a comprehensive approach is it expands so much further than what people traditionally think about sexuality education, okay? And really developing a lot of critical life skills. So when you think about this, when you start to realize, if you haven't already, and this is somewhat new, when we get into the nit and gritty of that, this is more than just talking about the birds and the bees and how to put on a condom and how to have safe sex. When we realize that it's so much more than that, it can be really overwhelming, and it's really hard to figure out where to start. So these are two really, really good resources out there that have a lot of free information for individuals. The SECUS is the Sexuality Information and Education Council. Again, in the US, not sure if something exists there, but again, if you go to these websites, I think there's a lot of information across countries, as well as things that just carry over in terms of what would make a comprehensive approach and what should be included. So they have some guidelines out there that are really, really helpful. Also, the Future of Sex Education Initiative, it's known as FOSS. They also have national sex education standards, and they're actually based off of the 8 national health education standards that exist. So if we're individuals working in the educational sector in the school system, they have a lot of really good resources to help you align things and possibly help make a case for why a certain goal or objective is going in an IEP related to this. And if we can cross them with the health standards, we might have a better chance of including more of these type of goals and objectives for our students that we're working with. And the thing about both of these are that they are great resources, but they don't tell teachers or practitioners what curriculum they should use or how they should do it. They essentially provide a framework for content across a lifespan. But they're not a curriculum, and they don't tell you how. Okay, so that is one thing to keep in mind as we go through. But the content of a comprehensive approach really spans way more than I also even knew of when I first started this. So when we look at the topic, this is from SECUS, and they have different areas. So for example, human development, I think the first few things we think about: anatomy, physiology, puberty, reproduction. Those tend to be standard things people can think about when we talk about sexuality education. However, if you look beyond that, body image, sexual orientation, gender and identity are other areas that are included in a comprehensive approach. Looking at relationships, moving from just being able to develop friendships to what it's like to move into that romantic, married, life commitments and children. Okay, different personal skills. And I think this is one of the highly missed areas when people think about sexuality education, is thinking about being able to identify your values and communicating your values, making decisions, being able to make choices of what you like and you don't like, being assertive, hey, knowing how to look for help when you need it. All of these things are areas that are included in that comprehensive approach and are put forth by these resources that every sexuality education program should include them. Now, we know we got some state laws and all of that prevent us from doing a lot of things, but with the comprehensive approach, the idea would be that we're touching on all of these things throughout our time educating our students. Another area too that tends to be maybe not necessarily thought of, but how sexuality aligns with society. If you look at society and culture, okay, looking at sexuality in the media, okay, especially nowadays with access to so many things through the internet, social media, it's really important to know about the laws that exist. Hey, when are we considered an adult and when are we not? Is it 16? Is it 18? And what can happen to us if we're accessing potentially sexual related content with minors and all of those kind of things? So it really spans a whole bunch of different areas and not just that anatomy and physiology parts. within each of these areas, the framework is that we start, and when we develop as sexual beings ourselves, it's a lifelong process. But that typically, whenever people think about sexual development, they just think about it as in the teenage years. Sometimes people overlap it with puberty as well, but things start to develop and change in subtle ways beginning in infancy. Okay, so sexuality education is really, when we think about the comprehensive approach, it's really thinking about starting in kindergarten and continuing on. Okay, we put the 12th grade here because a lot of the resources or things are related to when school age individuals. However, this would go beyond that as well, that it's an ever-going, ever-changing kind of process that we go through. But when we think about early on, a lot of people will see, wait a minute, you're going to be getting this in kindergarten? No way I want my child or a teacher. There's no way I'm going to be teaching kindergartners about sex at this young age. And that's a misconstruction of what the approach is really saying, is that early on, we start to become curious. Hey, how many people out there, and I know I can't see the chat, but I'm going to throw it out there, but hear little kids asking where I came from. Oh, you came from mommy's tummy. Well, how did I get in there? Right? These things start to happen at a really young age, and they get more complex as students grow. And that's how we should take the approach to our education and our programming in this area. So the nice thing that happens with a lot of the resources out there are that SECUS in particular will break down the topics that we looked at earlier into different levels. So they've kind of categorized them as like early, middle childhood, ages 5 to 8, pre-adolescence, early adolescence, and then adolescence up through high school. And they use these different levels to help with a scope and sequence. And they're not telling you how, they're not giving you the curriculum, but they're showing you that, yes, if we want to talk about relationships, here's where it would start, things you could start looking at for a very young child. And then they also show how they progress over time as individuals are aging and learning and just learning from their experiences. So here is an example about the topic of decision making. So if we're looking at making responsible decisions about sexuality, that it's important because decisions affect individuals and the people around them. They look at the developmental levels, and they will look at particular information to learn at those times. So thinking about how there's a contention about starting early, when we start looking at decisions, it's, well, I shouldn't say smaller things, but things that are not as intense in decision making. So just what clothes to wear, what toys you want to play with, who do you want to be friends with, right? And then progressing to more things about sexuality, sexual relationships, limits that you might have, and then also decisions related to legal implications. So just as you can see that it's not like we're trying to teach small children about these really high in-depth concepts, but we're going to gradually build these skills across time. And I think most people, I'd find a lot of people hard to argue the fact that decision making is an important concept for us all to start to learn about and important for us to grow as humans. Here's another one. Again, these are from this particular one here is from FOSS. The other information on the previous slide was from SECUS. But here, like healthy relationships, okay? Here we're not talking about being able to identify necessarily early on like sexual abuse and those kind of things and what it means to be able to give and take in a relationship. But maybe we start as just, what are good characteristics of a friend? Who do I want to be friends with? And then expanding that over time. So in the FOSS, they actually have like by second grade, a good kind of gauge is that they can do this. By fifth grade, this is a good place to be at. So I have found that that's been really helpful to see how we can start early and progress across time in a less fearful way of starting too young. Here's another one with personal safety, even just to give you an example. Again, these resources are freely available, but just to give you an example too of how by second grade, there's goals for us. By the end of 12th grade, there's goals for us, and so on across different areas. And again, this one's for personal safety. So as you start to realize, hey, I want to take this comprehensive approach, or I want to be an advocate for others, my clients, my student, my own child, whatever it may be, in the US, education is largely a state and local responsibility. So when you're getting started, we do need to think about, are there laws and requirements within our states that could prohibit me from doing certain things or allow me to do other things? So essentially, you always want to look at your state requirements to find out what regulations you have to follow. Then there is also the local school district. So all school districts are typically required to follow the state law. However, then the school boards have a voice, and they set the sexuality education policies for the school district. Okay, so that's where you're going to start to see some of the variability start to creep in. And some school boards may provide guidelines or standards related to the content, like this is what you need to do. Others may actually offer a curriculum or say we can only use this curriculum. So it would be really important to know those informations, if you're a teacher, or if you are trying to get something started or to advocate for your students, or you're consulting with a program. Knowing these things does become important on where to start and how to move forward from there. Another
Jen,
thing, yes.
can I deliver the second keyword? Folks, the second keyword is district. I repeat, the second keyword is district. Thank you.
So once you've kind of consulted the state and your individual school districts and done a little kind of figuring out what you're allowed to do and what you're not, we do need to get consent typically from a parent and caregiver, because traditionally most of the education, especially in a comprehensive approach, is starting really young. So there is a consent process. And actually some states have laws already in existence for this and policies they follow. So some require that a parental notification is sent out. So sometimes that means parents or guardians and caregivers may not know whether or not the education is happening because they're not being informed of it, because only 25 states in DC would require that to go out. 6 states require parental consent for students to participate, while others allow you to opt in. So you have to be aware of whether there's an opt-in for sexuality education or you have to opt out. Okay, which becomes important for a lot of our learners. If we need to opt into it and parents are unaware of that, that may be part of the problem why we're not getting education out to everybody who needs it. Okay, so sometimes we have an opt-in, sometimes we have opt-out. We also need to obtain assent from individuals themselves, that they want to be here, they want to be exposed to this type of education. We want them to make sure we are looking at assent and making sure that we are also have that active okay for them to continue to participate and be aware of assent withdrawal as we go through this process. We also want to think about parent and caregiver involvement. There is some literature that tells us when we have that in general with collaboration as a whole, when we're able to have parents and caregivers involved in what's happening, we are allowed to have that carryover into the home environment, which could be very, very beneficial, especially for the population of students that we were talking about today. So as you're going through that, we then have to think about, okay, we have consent, we have assent, we're good to go, but what about instruction? What do we use? What do we do? And there is a lack of curricula that are geared towards individuals with autism. There are some curricula that are identified to be for, the IDD population, but there are still not that many out there. I was fortunate to be a part of a project with Pam Wolf where we evaluated and really looked into a lot of different commercially available curricula to see what they were all about. And we found that majority of them covered a range of content, but then there was just so much variability within that range. There was no consistency on one curriculum to the next. Like every curriculum talked about different types of families, for example. That wasn't the case. Okay, so we did see a lot was covered, but there just was still such a range within that. They're also limited in terms of evidence-based instructional strategies. Hey, things that have been demonstrated to work for these populations were not included in the curricula that was supposed to be geared towards assisting in this area. So there was a lot of role play, a lot of lecture-based that may not be appropriate for a lot of the learners we work with. There's also a lack of varied assessments and suggestions on how to adapt and modify things. So if this doesn't work for my student, there's very little information on how I should go or where I should go to next. So with that, we have, as well as others in the field, have really looked at taking a behavior analytic approach to start establishing and strengthening behaviors related to sexuality content. Okay, so we have a technology and a science that helps us do these things, and we can apply it to a lot of the different areas of sexuality content that we want to uncover. So we're able to provide individualized explicit instruction. We have a means for systematic repeated measurement, the heart of our science of behavior that are going to help us be able to make sure that we are teaching skills, we get to that mastery, and we're able to move towards a fluency level so that we have individuals that are able to use these skills when they need them in real life. So we've kind of taken the standpoint, I know my colleagues and I, is that good instruction is good instruction, and we know we have a lot at our fingertips here to use so that we can start making more progress in this area. So for example, just to give you a little overview, we have options for using a discrete trial instruction, a more structured approach that, you know, breaks these skills down into their discrete components. And we're going to systematically teach skills over time. But things like identifying pictures of private body parts, identifying contraceptives, family types are all things that could be taught in that type of framework. Video modeling and prompting, although it is an evidence-based practice for individuals with autism, sometimes it's lacking when we move from the research to practice. So another kind of option out there is to use this type of video-based interventions to teach skills. So from hygiene tags to how to purchase a condom from a store, which is constantly changing nowadays, how things have to happen in stores. Prior to, you could just take them off the shelves. Now some stores are locking them up. So again, a lot of skills that we need to think about teaching. Taking birth control pills would be another option for video-based or video prompting methods. We know how to use visual prompts, right? We can do a pictorial representation of the steps of how to use a condom. Okay? We can look at proper positioning when using a urinal. Okay? Maybe we start using some scripts in those written cues for social interactions. Okay? Which, when we start at a young age, are going to help us develop those skills for when we start to get into wanting maybe sexual relationships and romantic relationships with partners. Chaining, forward, backwards, total task methodologies to teach behavioral chains. Okay, putting on makeup, disposing of a tampon, masturbating with a sex toy, if that is what somebody wants to choose to do. Okay, we have the technology at our fingertips to be able to do this. Direct instruction. So with direct instructions, we have well-developed, carefully planned lessons. Okay, so we are looking at remodeling. Sometimes you hear this as explicit instruction in the special education realm, but modeling, guided practice, individual practice, distributing that practice across time, where we're looking at including active participation. We may have some choral responding. We might have some, response boards where we're getting our students active within our lessons. Okay, or concept instructions. A lot of things that we talk about are really more concepts in nature in sexuality education. Self-esteem, dating, when it's appropriate to kiss someone, we can start looking at what is this concept? What are the critical features that make this self-esteem versus something else? And then providing examples and non-examples to be able to help a learner digest all of these really kind of more abstract ideas and thoughts. So we have a lot available to us. And what's nice is some more stuff is coming out in this area, but we are still lacking resources to help us get there. So when I'm thinking about, generally speaking, about sexuality education, again, we know it's controversial and it's often very hard to talk about. but everybody does deserve the right and the opportunity to be provided to them to learn about it so that they're able to make choices, they're able to develop skills to protect themselves, be happy in a healthy life in the way in which they choose. And if we do not provide this type of education, we are removing those rights that are inherent to all of us. And again, when we think about the critical components of comprehensive education plans, sexuality education should be embedded in there. We should not be waiting until something happens for us to then realize, ooh, we might need to start talking about this with them, or, you know, starting at the beginning age will help us kind of gear towards a more comprehensive amount of information that we can provide, as well as allowing students to grow over time and to start making decisions for themselves about what they want and they don't want to have as they move forward into, particularly into adulthood. So when we look at these things, I think one of the biggest parts of these, when my colleagues were working on our book, we started to find all these things, and there's resources here and there, but again, the general amount of literature or direction out there in here is still quite limited to this day. So what we have put together, and again, I am not one to self-promote, so this is so uncomfortable for me to even share this, but it is also it's a near and dear, a labor of love to put this guide together that we did. So everything you've heard today and more are things that are included in our new book that we just published, A Complete Guide to Sexuality Education for Students with Developmental Disabilities. Within this book, we go through some of the information that I provided you with, Jay, like the history and state of things, but then we move into how do we get started in much greater detail? What do we include? Well, how do we do assessment? How do we start teaching basics of applied behavior analysis for individuals that might not be familiar with that, thinking about special education or teachers? We have instructional strategies, we have sample lessons. We've developed some models of how to start from the ground up of individualizing sexuality education, as well as different models to help with different teaching concepts and things like that. We also have included evaluation tools. So if you have a curriculum, how do you know if it's a good one? So we tried to pack this thing full of anything somebody can need if this was a new area to them and they really want to start getting involved and learn more about the area. So lots of resources in here, data sheets, like I said, sample programs. We've even taken existing programs and modifying them to something that might be more appropriate for some of the learners in which you work with, so that we can start kind of pushing this forward a little bit more and start having some more information out there, because it is such an area of still in great need. So I did include a link here if you're interested in seeing more about the book. But obviously, it is definitely something that we are really happy to get out there and share with our communities. And hopefully it helps some people out and gives you a lot of resources that you might not have known about, or just to expand on different areas that maybe you knew about, but maybe we can help out in some ways and give you a little bit more to look at really the best way to teach different things in this area. We also talk about reducing unwanted behaviors as well, and some strategies and tips and tricks and cheat sheets on how to do those kind of things, especially when a lot of this is new. So just wanted to kind of conclude with that everything today. Obviously, there's lots of resources out there. We've combined and put a guide together to try to encompass as much as we can. We kind of call it a soup to nuts kind of book, where you could get from the started to the end and just have a lot of information in there. So if you're interested, here's the link. And of course, on the next slide, I do also have my email address. If you have any more questions or something you would be interested in or anything else, please feel free to email me. I'd love to hear from you, but that's all I have.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you very much. Quick question. Is the book available only as a hard copy
Oh,
or is it also available as an ebook?
yes, thank you for the prompt, Thanos. So right now it is currently only available in the hardcover book. However, the ebook should be out in the next couple of weeks. The publishing company Greatness Achieved is updating their website, and once the update is done, I was told the ebook would be available, because I do know that shipping outside of the US is problematic for you all. So I did make sure that I put in a plug for our publishers to make sure that there would be an ebook available, and shockingly, it's actually already in the works. So that should be out in the next couple weeks.
Brilliant. All right. I have some questions for you, but let me deliver the last keyword.
Okay.
In case folks need to go. I know we have some folks who have parental responsibilities. So the last keyword, folks, is purple, as in the color purple. Okay, the last keyword is purple, as in the color purple. Okay, so first of all, the first question I had is, what if the practitioner does not accept same-sex relations?
Oh, that's a hard one. So one of the things that is highly suggested in when you're looking at delivering this type of education is that what confounds a lot of it is individuals' own biases and own thoughts and what they believe is right, and the way they're, also we got some ableist approaches there. One of the recommendations is that we need to work on looking at our bias and removing those, which is never quite easy to do. There are some recommendations out there in the literature of just ways that we can provide individuals that might have those type of feelings with just more information on why, though, we do need to teach this. And I know some people, we're behavior analysts, so we love data, but not everybody does. But sometimes showing some of those stats has been successful. Like, I know you don't believe this, but this is what's going to happen if we don't do these things. Or look at the amount of individuals in this area that are identifying as non-binary or, gay or transgender. All of those kinds of things sometimes does help, but I will be fully transparent. There are some people that will not budge on a lot of their beliefs, and then that impacts our students. And the recommendations that I've seen prior to are just those people should not be teaching this. So that does kind of I feel like that's not a great answer. But that is one of the very hard thing, that when we're asking others to start talking about this, that this may not be what they wanted to do initially. That is highly prevalent in the areas of people's own beliefs then impacting what they teach. And shockingly, there are curricular out there that include things like that. So there's also people putting out information that, same-sex marriage is, immoral and all of these things. So, and they exist in some of those curriculums. So it's not an easy thing to navigate. I think trying to educate those people or allow them to try to sit with, I understand you may feel this way, but this is what we need to do for the client, or the client is requesting these, and my opinion should not matter. It should be what is best for them. So trying some of those conversations could be helpful. I do honestly, though, firmly believe that there are some people that maybe this isn't the best area for them to teach in, and that maybe we should try to figure out what could be a better situation to help caveat that, because that's definitely a big, big issue and a big problem.
Someone said in response to this discussion that they find that sex education awareness training with staff teams helps break down taboos.
Yeah.
I would also like to remind us that our ethics code clearly says that we don't discriminate based on these things, right? So if you're a behavior analyst and you think, I don't like same-sex marriage or whatever, and I'm just not going to do what I'm supposed to do and deliver services, you're literally breaking the ethics code. Just a kind reminder to us all.
So I think that's a great idea with, having those proactive approaches with teachers or practitioners, or who are going to be able to provide that content to try to help, make it less taboo. And I think that's a great way to phrase it too.
Another comment / question, it's mostly a comment, but I think it will get the conversation going. Someone said, I hear staff team members sometimes saying that masturbation, either male or female, is actually the problem, rather than understanding the when it's appropriate, why, where, and so on. So how do we deal with situations where this kind of bias might be in place? Does it go back to kind of, as we discussed already, like the awareness training and so on? Or do you have any other kind of recommendations in the book that might help people navigate those situations?
We tended in the book to lean more towards that basically that's an area that needs to be looked at. We didn't necessarily provide a training or things like that to specifically help people in that area. And I think given our focus on the book was to get towards the educational piece and implementation parts of this. But I think, again, that just comes back to awareness training and education, and hopefully trying to embed some of, like, Thanos, I think it was awesome that you talked about our ethics code and things like that, to try to get people on board. And it may be too, like, having tough conversations. I know just from being in practice so many years, like, if I went into and started talking to a family and I was like, you need to do this, and this, they're going to look at me like I have 27 heads and really probably not want to do anything that I'm asking them to do. And it's about rapport building. So I think some of the recommendations we've had in the past too is that when we're working with a teacher or a practitioner or even a parent, we may not be able to go like guns blazing at this right away. We may need to take some small steps to get there, and maybe starting with some rapport building with that particular practitioner or family, and then slowly moving them to a place where they are comfortable. It may take some of that time, and it really sometimes reminds me of like a parent training model where we meet the parent where they are and start to slowly and systematically kind of change their behavior and move that kind of way. So I know I've had some success in practice doing those type of things, of when it was families, I have families that have been so on board and said, if I need to go in there and teach my son how to masturbate appropriately, I'm going to do it. Whereas another parent's like, oh my gosh, like I can't even say that word out loud. And the approach there would have to be a little bit, I think, slower. And I think if we can start to have a good rapport with the people we're working with, we may be able to then start kind of adding in the awareness training and those kind of things to inform them of what also are going to be the repercussions if we don't do some of this. Hopefully that's helpful.
It is absolutely helpful. I'm going to transition to a different question, but before I do so, because I know that in the recording, the chat is not going to be visible, just reading a comment that links to this, and then I'll transition to a different topic. We talk about the division between personal and professional ethics, which has to happen when operating with patients, caregivers, and so on. And someone said that this happens in medicine too, that regardless of your personal beliefs, you would, of course, deliver, for example, services needed. So I think these are fantastic comments, and I wanted to make sure they are captured in the recording for people who watch later.
So that's awesome.
The next question for you, Jenn, is what role should the parents play in teaching sexuality to their own children? The person says, I understand that we as professionals can assist with the topic, but how much focus should we put on parents to be teaching these things than for us to just take control and teach these things to the clients ourselves?
Yeah, and I think that's such a great point and question. If I know we in the book too, we actually wrote this so it would be parent friendly as well, to advocate parents that they also may need to teach some of these things and can have a role, and that when we work alongside families, we're going to have a lot better outcomes. So I know I've with doing some of these talks throughout the last couple of years, I know some people were like, I work for an adult agency and we're not allowed to touch this topic at all. And then there was a parent sitting in there and she's like, well, if that's the case, give me everything I need to know, because I'm going to be the one that needs to teach him what to do so he doesn't end up with legal ramifications and those kind of things. So I think just like any other kind of services many of us provide, when we can collaborate, have parents on board, and allow them to also work on these things in the areas, especially if we're stuck with what do you call it, like parameters that we can't get around, parents are going to have a good portion of this on them to help with too. So I know we never broached any of these topics without parents' consideration, obviously, as well as the individual themselves. So I do believe that we are going to get the best outcomes if we can also teach parents about this and have them assist in some of these educational pieces. It'll also see better carryover and generalization if we're able to do those kinds of things. But I have run into families that are like, you do everything, I'm good with that. And then the opposite end is like, parents give me everything, I'll do it. But when we get down to those conversations about that it's not available, nor are we getting our district to budge, for example, our school district. I've worked with some families where they were the ones who were doing some of this education and buying the curricula and doing those things because they saw the importance of it. So having those conversations with the parent, but I definitely 100% would say is that we should have parents on board and having them an active participant in this if we are going to do the best for the clients that we serve.
Another question says, does the book also cover educating the adult population that have not previously received adequate sexuality education?
I would say it crosses all sectors. So it's looking at all of the content across the lifespan. So absolutely, I think it would be a valuable resource for any age range. We did not particularly put it towards just, elementary age or things like that. It is much more of a general broad approach so that this information could be looked at and starting to modify and evaluate either existing or creating your own materials based off of the needs at that time of that learner. So if we are looking at adults and being able to start there, if they have very little in this area, the topics, we may be looking at teaching topics, although they say they're for a 12th grader, we might be looking at this individual doesn't have any knowledge of things that fall at a much younger level, and we could start there. So I would absolutely say it's for any age range. It's not particular to just school age.
I think you've partially answered the next question as well. Someone says, I totally agree sexual education should be broken down and start from an early age. However, unfortunately, this is not the case due to various reasons as the presentation highlighted. How do you bridge that gap of teaching skills to adults? Could you jump to a higher level of skills teaching when the learner has not been exposed to more foundational teaching like more foundational skills at an earlier age?
I mean, I definitely think it's an individual situation, but from what we know is if we're missing some of those foundational skills, we may get by for a little bit, but eventually if we are missing knowledge or skills needed to do more complex behaviors or understand more complex concepts related to this, we would need to make sure those are solid to begin with. So I do think for some, we may need to go back and teach some things that some people may say, oh, well, this is for a younger learner. But if I'm missing those components of my repertoire, I'm not going to be able to combine them and use them the other ways to be able to be successful and make these choices for myself in the long run. So I think looking at it that the CCAS in them, yes, they have those age ranges. For me, I've always looked at it that those just give me ideas of what to look for students. And if they don't have them, I'm just going to take those labels off that this is for a 5 to 8 year old if they're going to benefit my client, because I can then build off of these. So with any type of more complex, and we have our these composite skills that involve so much, we do need to break it down, and we might need to create that stronger foundation to actually get them there and to be successful long term with making decisions and all of that.
Great. Thank you, Jenn. I'm not going to read all the thank yous and the excellent presentation, but just so you know, way too many people have said that they found this very valuable and they're going to share it with colleagues and so on. And that's music to my ears. Okay, folks, this was the last behavioral talk of this academic year. Hopefully, we will pick it up again in the next academic year. Thank you so much for those of you that kept me company all year. Most importantly, thank you to Dr. Wertalik for taking the time to talk to us about her work and the work of her colleagues, and of course the book that I'm pretty sure everybody's going to now go in and order because it's such a valuable resource. This will go up on YouTube soon. I will prepare your certificate soon. Please don't email me. I've technically got 45 days to do so. Okay, so don't worry if you don't receive them in a day or two, but I will get them to you in due time. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Jenn, thanks again, and hopefully you will come back soon to let us know about the rest of your work, because that's not the only thing that you do that's really valuable for people with additional needs. So thank you, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Jenn.
Thank you so much. Take care, everybody.
Bye, guys.